Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr, and this is our weekly hour devoted to conversations of particular importance to people of African descent and to everyone else working together to build a better society and a better world. As we know, and in April, early April this year, the Tennessee three members of the Tennessee State Legislature were up on charges that they had disrupted the legislature, had violated the rules of the House of Representatives, of the House, the Tennessee State House, and were threatened with expulsion. Two of those three, Justin Pearson out of Memphis and Justin Jones out of Nashville, were in fact expelled. And the third of the Tennessee three, Gloria Johnson out of the Knoxville area, East Tennessee, only survived being expelled by one vote. This sparked, of course, a number of protests and demonstrations, some of which you've seen here on the Black Star Network. Our friend and brother, Dr. William Barber, and the Moral Monday movement made its way to Middle Tennessee, to the Tennessee State House. And we've seen a lot of pushback against the Tennessee legislature, which is one of those super gerrymandered districts behind the Cotton Curtain in the U.S. South, but it is not alone. There are at least 30 legislatures in this country where you have the Republican Party, through gerrymandering, through efforts at voter suppression and other tactics, have achieved control. And we're going to talk today with someone who has been pushing back for a very long time. He is in the full arc of conversations we've had over the last year or so about threats to democracy here in the United States. He is a lawyer. He is a writer, a political activist. He's also a former elected official. In fact, he was the chairman of his native state's Democratic Party for about 6 years, between 2015 and 2021. He is, of course, David Pepper. He's the author of a book that we strongly recommend everyone get and read, and stay on the lookout, because we're about to see a subsequent volume that's going to expand on the solutions dimension of this book. It's called Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. Former councilman, Hamilton County Cincinnati City Councilman, lawyer, activist. Welcome to the Black Table, David Pepper.
Thank you. It's great to join the table today and to be with you.
Oh, man, the pleasure is ours. And we were particularly happy to have you. We've talked in several installments about the Supreme Court cases that are coming down the pike, particularly that North Carolina case, Moore versus Harper, the Alabama gerrymandering case, of course, Milligan. And you not only write from your insight as a lawyer and as a legal scholar, law professor, in fact, but you write as someone who has fought against these anti-democratic waves from the ground. Could you and in this book, everybody, when you all read Laboratories of Autocracy, you'll see it's in 3 parts. And part 3 is all solutions phase. In part 1 and part 2, you kind of lay out what we're facing. And a lot of people are, despondent, depressed. They think this thing can't be reversed. Maybe, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book, and maybe we can enter part 1 of the book, where you lay out some pretty austere shenanigans in Cincinnati.
I do. It's a painful. So I want people to read the book, but I want to warn you in advance. It's a painful read in many ways, but I do it, and I write it in a way that. And I've written a bunch of novels, so hopefully someone said to me, a Time magazine guy said to me, "Hey, congratulations, you wrote the first book on statehouses. It was actually interesting to read."
Yes.
So I put a lot of storytelling in it, but my mission is, until we confront and see how bad the attack on democracy is and where it's happening, which is our state houses, just like Tennessee's and Ohio's, until we confront it in the full sort of scope of and scale of it, we will not overcome it. And so as much as I walk through the painful details of what it looks like, I do that first, because then the solutions start to make a lot more sense. And the failures of the current approach to the attack on democracy become clear, and it becomes clear why they're failing. So I basically, I'm very active on social media. I'm very active on Twitter. And a couple years ago, about March of 21, as we were all still celebrating the Biden victory, I'm watching one other round of voter suppression in Ohio, and it always happens, and as it's happening around the country. And to get to why I wrote this book, I almost tweeted the very simple tweet, hey, these are supposed to be laboratories of democracy, but they're acting more like laboratories of autocracy. I literally looked at the tweet, thought, I'm not going to send that tweet. That's more than a tweet. And so then I started writing an op-ed about it, and I thought, you know what? It's more than an op-ed. And 3 months later, I honestly had finished the book.
Really?
So the book tries to walk through using Ohio, but it's much bigger than Ohio. Here's what their operation looks like. This is where they are doing the most damage. It's not Marjorie Taylor Greene, and it's not George Santos. It's those Tennessee gerrymandered Republicans who attack and attack and attack. And because they're gerrymandered in districts they don't think they can lose, and because too often they're not even contested in the next election, despite how awful they are behaving, they just keep going and going. And until we get to that space and start taking them on where they are, and not only focus on whatever Marjorie Taylor Greene tweeted today, they're going to keep winning. And I wrote the book to expose what their big picture strategy is, how they fight it, where they fight it. And then all of a sudden, the solutions I propose make a lot more sense. And the mistakes we are making every single day, all of a sudden become very painfully clear. So That's why I wrote the book. And I try and write in a way, as hopefully you'll agree, it's interesting to read, although painful.
Yes. In fact, that's exactly the point I wanted to make. And I neglected to mention that you're a novelist. In fact, one of our previous guests, and you told us before the show started, your fellow Yale Law alum, Kermit Roosevelt, also a novelist, but I don't think he's written as many as you have. But the way you open this text, I agree. I agree with the reporter for the Times in terms of this being a compelling narrative. Right there in the introduction, when you write, it was a traffic jam only Chris Christie could admire. Immediately we think about that bridge in Jersey and the pay to play, but it wasn't about that. It was about drop boxes. Could you help us understand how this thing that looks like a small thing is really part of a much larger strategy?
Yes. Let me put it this way. So I got into it, and I'll say I was proud in Ohio. I was pretty litigious when it came to voting rights. So I got into some major lawsuits in Ohio about drop boxes. And I'll just put it this way. There have been drop boxes for years in America that voters could vote conveniently at drop boxes in Anchorage, Alaska, Salt Lake City, Utah. No one cared. No one said there was fraud with drop boxes. No one said there was something wrong with drop boxes. It's been going on for years in certain states, in certain cities. Only when voters of color and Black voters began to use drop boxes in high numbers during COVID,
yes,
in Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, did people start to say, oh, drop boxes are bad, we got to get rid of them. And I got into a massive struggle here in Ohio because during COVID, I too wanted drop boxes here in Ohio. Our Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, lied for months, saying there was no legal authority to add more drop boxes. I took him to court. I proved in repeated court hearings and ultimately judicial decisions, including by Republicans, that he was lying, that he had every power to expand drop boxes. And after we won those lawsuits, we couldn't force him to add them, but we made it clear that he was lying when he said he couldn't. He created one drop box per county, one drop box location for a county of 1 million people, like Cleveland, like the greater Cleveland, Cuyahoga County, Cincinnati. And so, I opened the book up with descriptions of traffic jams that his one drop box rule created, knowing full well that's what would happen. And the worst part of that story, so it's voter suppression in action, that people sitting around in their cars, having driven 40 minutes to one drop box, they then reach a traffic jam because there's only one. And the worst part about the story is after he succeeded in only having one drop box per county, there were dozens in Atlanta, there were many in Detroit. What's happened after that? That became the model. Oh, wow, we can create limitations on drop boxes for the future. No one liked, at least on the Republican side, that black voters disproportionately use drop boxes all over the country. So all over the country now we have legislation to create the same traffic jams or to actually not even allow drop boxes at all. When only a few years ago, when voters in Salt Lake City and Anchorage were using drop boxes, no one cared. It's a perfect example of how aggressive the suppression is, but also, as I give that book title, Laboratories of Autocracy, about how these states are always learning from one another. And here we have a drop box rule created traffic jams, made things more difficult. In a normal world, you'd say, well, if you create a traffic jam, you'd want to get rid of the traffic jam. But if your goal is voter suppression, that traffic jam is what you want. So all of a sudden, within months of the traffic jams in Ohio, we have people all around the country trying to replicate them. It's a perfect example of how voter suppression works and how they look for successes as they consider them and try and mimic them around the country. And it started with long lines in that, like I described in that book, right, only a few minutes from where I'm sitting today, and similar lines in Akron, Ohio, and Cleveland, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, all around the state.
I remember, in fact, here on the network, Roland Martin one night, the lines in Franklin County, of course, where Columbus is. And of course, he's from Houston, Harris County. And we saw something very similar. And I know in our second block, we want to ask you about not this metaphor of the bunker and how that expands out with ALEC. And I hope you'll walk us through a little bit of what ALEC is and how, in fact, some of these legislators are so lazy that the model legislation they draft, they don't even change much of the language, if anything. And so now they're replicating this thing. In fact, maybe what we'll do here is pause. And when we come back from the break, we'll ask you to delayer a little bit more and give us some of the other strategies folks are using to weaponize the state houses. And the equation that you introduce in kind of lead us into in part 3 of the book, when you say broken democracy plus corruption plus this coordination ends up in this mess. So I hope you'll kind of, we'll follow your lead to see where you want to go in that and kind of open this up for us. So we'll be back in a moment here at the Black Table with our guest, David Pepper, author of Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. Back in a moment.
I'm Faraji Muhammad, live from LA. And this is The Culture. The Culture is a two-way conversation. You and me. We talk about the stories, politics, the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. So join our community every day at 3 p.m. Eastern and let your voice be heard. Hey, we're all in this together. So let's talk about it and see what kind of trouble we can get into. It's The Culture, weekdays at 3, only on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. We are here with the author of Laboratories of Autocracy, David Pepper. He also has a companion website, by the way, and you'll see it down below in the lower thirds, laboratoriesofautocracy.com. David, the first part of your book was very familiar to me. Like as we talked about before we started, I lived in Ohio for about 5 years, and Ohio is not a red state. We watch television and we see red states and blue states, but as you have lived there your whole life, what you like fourth or fifth generation, I think, Ohio, when I got the opportunity to spend some time in Ohio, you make some very interesting points about Ohio. Some people might call you a cheerleader. I think we see your high school classmates say you'd be most likely to be elected president of the Chamber of Commerce. But what you say about Ohio is quite striking. Do you mind sharing with our viewers, why is Ohio such a perfect place to begin this conversation?
Sure. Well, because we haven't been a red state. We're a toss-up state. We lean a little red, but we're not legislating like we're a little red. We're legislating like we're far, far right. And that's what happens once these state houses get hijacked by the far right. Then they gerrymander, they suppress the opposition, And that allows them to legislate in a way that doesn't reflect the people of that state. And one thing to be clear, and I really, I emphasize this in the book, this all began long before Donald Trump ran for anything. This day and age, everyone equates the attack on democracy, Donald Trump. All of this was a backlash to the Obama coalition getting its way in 2008 in Ohio, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, for goodness sakes, in Indiana, in Iowa. The attack on democracy that I talk about in this book that we are seeing today began before Donald Trump ever thought of running for president. We have to see that. And it didn't just happen because Obama won Ohio, although that was historic. It happened because the Obama coalition, a diverse democracy, got its way. And there's a long history in this country, as you know better than I do, I'm sure, of a backlash, a white backlash, whenever a diverse democracy says, hey, we're now the majority. And that's what happened in Ohio and all these other states in 2008. So the minute they had a chance in 2011 to say, oh, not so fast, we're going to gerrymander you, we're going to suppress the voters that make up big chunks of your coalition, so you're not going to be the majority going forward, that's what they did in Ohio. They did it through attacking early vote. They did it through, as we talked about, where they privately in a hotel room they called the bunker, gerrymandered the heck out of this place. So that, when Obama won in 2008, Democrats also won the majority of the Ohio State House. We had the majority of the congressional seats. So it was an up and down victory driven by that Obama coalition. And they basically decided in 2011, never again. And with that, they created this system like in Tennessee and other states, you mentioned dozens of them, no accountability in the state level politics of places like this. And what we have seen since 2011, and this is the part where being that Ohio cheerleader, it's a painful thing to walk through, like I do in this book. Once you have no accountability, like we have in these states, you see a downward spiral. Extremism, corruption, terrible public outcomes, and to keep it all going, further attacks on democracy, because if you had corruption and terrible public outcomes and extremism in a fair district, you'd lose your next election, wouldn't you? So They have to keep locking down democracy to stay in power, given that they have results that wouldn't otherwise succeed in a fair democracy. So we see these states like Ohio in a tailspin downward without any brakes to stop it. That's why every once in a while, Washington and people who are on the coast will look at Tennessee and will look at Ohio and say, my God, how'd it get so bad? What's happening there? This does not look like anything like a normal democracy. It's because for years, these places have been in these sort of zones of no accountability, and the spiral downward is accelerating very quickly.
Actually, I'm glad you raised that because, of course, we all learned as children here in the United States, and, there are viewers from around the world. So, in fact, the fact that you spent some time overseas and did some work and then kind of bring that as a sensibility that informs the book in terms of the fact that the idea that the United States wouldn't tolerate this if this was going on in another country. But, we all learned about the co-equal branches of government. But you make a very interesting point in terms of policy making, that every time this kind of radicalized group of people who are trying to control our society through the electoral process feel threatened, they adjust in the next election cycle to pass laws and policies. And you're saying there's even attacks on co-equal branches of government, and you use the Ohio Supreme Court as an example. Could you help us illustrate what are you talking about there? Because we're seeing in Wisconsin now.
Yeah,
this is an attempt.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Let me explain this way. Ohio had our Wisconsin moment in 2020. Wisconsin, just for those who haven't watched, huge win when they won a Supreme Court seat about 3 weeks ago. Wisconsin's had among the worst gerrymandering and voter suppression in the country. This fair court hopefully gives them a chance to fix that. Well, we had the same thing happen in 2020 when we won the third Democratic seat out of 7 after having had 0 only a couple years before. And we had an independent-minded Chief Justice. So we also finally, for the first time in years, had an independent court. Here's what the gerrymandered legislature, Republican legislature, did after losing that court race. One, they changed the rules of how we elect courts so that party ID is on the ballot. So they hope to have the results of their court races be as partisan as they are. Number 2, they are literally gerrymandering the appellate districts of Ohio to get better results. And number 3, knowing that they would get a better court under these rules, or they hoped to get that in 2 years, they simply ignored rulings they didn't like for a year and a half. They violated the Ohio Constitution 7 times to gerrymander their own map in violation of that Constitution. And when the Supreme Court of Ohio said they were breaking the law, they just ignored them. And they ignored it until the new court took effect, because they had changed the rules this coming January. As you just said, and this is true about so much of the state house activity we're seeing, if we saw the behavior, lawless, undemocratic, extreme, banning books and trying to ban our history being taught, if we saw the behavior in Tennessee and Ohio and Missouri and Florida in another country, we would literally say, my God, that country is losing its democracy in front of all of us. We'd call in USAID or the State Department to say, help this country not lose its democracy. It's happening in our own country, right up the street from where all of us live, and it's like we don't even see it.
Do you mind,
as you hinted, we're overconfident. We live in a sort of a privileged post-Voting Rights Act America where we think, well, democracy is here to stay no matter what. And my former boss, we talked about him earlier, Nate Jones,
yes,
and John Lewis would say, are you kidding? What do you think we had to fight for all those years to get to the 1970s and 80s? Democracy isn't just there automatically. Absolutely. You got to fight for it. And if you don't, you can lose it. But we've had this sort of privileged post-60s view that's all okay. So we see another country as an attack, and we would say to that country, you better step up. When it happens in our own country at the state house level, we hardly notice. And that is a real danger long term. And that's, again, why I wrote this book I wrote.
Absolutely. And I don't want to miss this opportunity to, again, take that global kind of perspective and apply it locally. You had the occasion between undergrad at Yale and then Yale Law to spend 3 years abroad. And you were, in the way I understand it, interacting with the city of St. Petersburg, at least interacting between going there and then being in D.C. with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Did you, and you talk about the fact, at least in your bio, you allude to the fact that one of the officials there at that local level in Russia was the vice mayor of St. Petersburg. Give us a sense of how we critique people overseas, but in fact, what's going on here in terms of corruption is how would you even put those two things in conversation?
Yeah, it is interesting. So the vice mayor, when I worked there, was Vladimir Putin. So I used to have meetings with him regularly. I don't want that to scare you. We were doing good stuff.
Well, no. This is what I want you to
Yeah. No, I met with Putin all the time. And I was there, and you remember this, in the mid-90s, we thought Russia was on its way to being a democracy. That was the work I was doing. That was the work that Clinton and Yeltsin were doing.
Absolutely.
And we've seen what happens when someone starts attacking the core institutions, the core balances of a democracy. All of a sudden, that hope is clearly all gone. It's gone in places like Hungary. It can happen. And that's why I always say we have blinders on, I'm afraid, in the United States. One, it's so partisan, we don't see it for what it is. Two, we focus on people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Santos and Trump and not institutions. And three, the institution we really don't focus on are state houses, which end up making them the perfect place to attack democracy because we're all watching Washington. We're not watching where the damage is being done. And then once they win those places, they can gerrymander the heck out of them. And so they can do the damage, even if we are watching, like in Tennessee. They don't care. They're never held accountable. So what we would see so clearly elsewhere, we don't see here. And I think having worked overseas makes it maybe more clear to me. And once you see it, my hope is you can't unsee it in our own country. And my hope is over time, it inspires people to see that we are in the same fight for democracy that John Lewis was in. And we better see it that way. That means it's not every 2 years in a federal election. It means it's on all the time, everywhere. And it's in your state house. It's in your community. And there are many more things we can all do about it than we typically do when we only think it's about a couple federal elections in some state far away from where we live.
Absolutely. And again, we'll spend probably most of the rest of our time walking through some of these solutions as we anticipate your forthcoming book. And when you talk about fighting everywhere, and investing everywhere. And you give us examples like the governor of Kansas and the pushbacks, even when redefining victory, as you talk about. One of the things that you just mentioned a moment ago as it relates to the legislature basically thumbing its nose at the judiciary, you talk about corruption a lot.
Yeah.
What is this kind of impunity? I'm assuming it's always been with us, but and then maybe we'll pick this up on the other side of the break, but if you want to say a line or two about how corruption plays in this, we'd be grateful.
Yeah, so much of what's driving the takeover of state houses is big money. People always ask me, what's driving this? There's sort of different types of politics. There is a strand of our history of white supremacy, and it still is with us, and that's driving some of the folks in this. There's also other types of extremism in politics, but there's a lot of big money that understand that state houses end up being the perfect place for people to make a lot of money, be it energy companies, for-profit schools. And once you have no accountability, these places become more than just sort of personal bribe types of corruption. The entire purpose of these places becomes a corrupted form of public service. It's taking public assets and giving them to private entities. It's sort of on steroids, Brett Favre taking money meant for poor folks in Mississippi and using it for volleyball courts.
Absolutely.
All over this country, these state houses are basically taking public resources, our public goods, our tax dollars, and they give them to private entities. And because they can't be held accountable, they keep doing it. And that's why we see corruption all over. And we also see a dramatic decline in public outcomes, be it schools or student debt or healthcare, you name it, in states that once had very strong results. Because the public goods are being forked over to private players, they make the money, the public pays the price. Absolutely. And so these places, corruption is endemic to these hijacked state houses. When you have no accountability to the public, the private quickly starts grabbing the funds, and the public can't do anything to stop it.
Oh, yeah. Well, we want to pick up with that in a moment. We'll take a break, and when we come back, let's keep along that line for a little bit, and then we'll open up into what you lay out in terms of some very pragmatic, very clear solutions to fight back against these laboratories of autocracy and reestablish, as you quote Louis Brandeis early in the book, these laboratories of democracy. And you even point out some of the victories that we've had along the way. So we'll be back in a moment with David Pepper, author of Laboratories of Autocracy, here at the Black Table. Back in a moment.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
Hold no punches.
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr. Remember to support the Black Star Network. Join the Bring the Funk fan club, download the app, tell your friends, tell your family, tell everybody. The conversations we're having here are indeed unique across all platforms. So support all the shows on the platform. We're back with our guest, David Pepper, author of Laboratories of Autocracy. David, when we left, you had opened up this window into corruption. And of course, you're not talking about, at least you didn't lead with the kind of big headline stuff that we see, like Harlan Crow seemingly having rented out a justice on the Supreme Court, at least one. We know Sam Alito and his dinner parties and the allegations of leaking draft opinions, but they seem to be a rogue court. John Roberts doesn't seem to want to investigate anything except who leaked, and maybe he doesn't even want to do that. But your discussion of corruption and the impact it has on people who are voting for some of these legislators is really quite striking. Could you talk to us about, again, another big ticket item that we've probably been aware of, at least vaguely, 2010 Citizens United unleashing all this money, and then of course Shelby County in 2013 versus Holder and kind of attacking voting rights. But you talk about these coordinated efforts. These aren't just like individuals in kind of a broad sense. Could you talk a little bit about what ALEC is and how some of this stuff is, much of it in fact, is coordinated? Yeah,
and so the point is there's individual acts of corruption where people are getting bribes and they sometimes get prosecuted. But my worry is there's a much bigger corruption of the very notion of public service. And these state houses have become the place that if you want, and this takes us to ALEC, if your goal is to grab hold of public assets for your benefit, in the way that Brett Favre did, for example,
yes,
and you are a private company, state houses are where you can get it done. Far better than Congress, everyone's paying attention. And it turns out that in a world of no accountability with gerrymandering and suppression, the incentives that these legislators face actually rewards giving money to private entities who then give you money back. And the public who pays the cost of that giveaway can't vote you out anyway. And so here's the good news is, Democrats and others who care about democracy are starting to read my book and figure this out. The bad news is ALEC never had to read my book. They've been doing this for 20 years.
Right.
I didn't have to fill them in. They understood the weakness of state houses going back decades, and they understood that state houses offer the perfect set of incentives that they can take advantage of to benefit their members. So what ALEC does, it's called the American Legislative Exchange Council. Not about governors, not about senators. It's about state house and legislators. It basically takes everything I've talked about and puts it on steroids. It doesn't go one state at a time. It says across the states that we control, that we've hijacked, that no longer answerable to their own people, we are going to just rush through bill after bill that we write in some hotel room somewhere that benefits our members, be it, utilities or gun companies or energy companies or for-profit schools. And these state houses, sufficiently hijacked, will do everything we ask. And the sad truth is it's worked incredibly well. And so they keep doing it. And as you said earlier, if something succeeds in Florida, they bring it to Ohio. And then they say, well, look, it happened in Florida. We'll do it here. If something fails, they'll learn from that mistake and correct for it. If that rule about drop boxes caused a long line in Ohio, well, everyone else starts doing it in all these other states. So we see basically a harnessing, a weaponizing of these broken state houses to accomplish this much bigger sort of far-right agenda that most of these states themselves wouldn't actually support. Kansas, that referendum on abortion access in Kansas,
yes,
is the tell. These places no longer represent even conservative states. They are hijacked by the far right and big money, and they're pushing that agenda, and they're able to push it, one, because of gerrymandering, which seals these people off into little fortresses of unaccountability, and two, because we do them the favor of never paying attention to it anyway. So they're just churning and churning away. And again, the reason I wrote my book is we're off celebrating Biden and Kamala Harris winning in 21 while they're suppressing and gerrymandering in the middle at the same time, and too little people even see that it's happening. So, but again, to go back to what I said before the break, there's so much money driving it. It's not like this is charity or civic service for them. This is an investment that pays back many times over in tax breaks and giveaways and public school funds being forked over to private for-profit scams. Some of that money goes back to the legislators as contributions or dark money. It's money driven, a lot of it, and it's crushing public outcomes in states like Ohio as we speak.
I was going to ask you about that. In fact, I'm sure you saw, and we're all looking at this development in Oklahoma with this virtual charter school, this Catholic school. They're really after the establishment clause. It seems like John Roberts, it seems like he's going to run everything through the First Amendment. And I'm sure if you want to make any comment on that, fine, we got some time. But I want to ask you, you raise up a particular case. I think Governor Kelly is in Kansas, and how what they did in Kansas, they got an extreme pushback. And as we kind of turn toward how you say how we can attack this and kind of reverse some of this stuff, do you mind saying a few words about how this thing backfired on them in Kansas, and as a result, people came together?
And we can do this. If you could do it in Kansas, you could do it in a lot of places. If you've heard anything I've said, it's that the MO of these state houses is taking public goods and forking them over to private players. And automatically with that model will be declining public outcomes that everyday people feel. And the smartest politicians in these tougher states figure out that many of these outcomes, once exposed, are deeply unpopular and become a real vulnerability to the people in charge. In Michigan, it was fix the damn roads. The roads across Michigan were falling apart. Most people experienced that. They hit a pothole, they had to pay money. Gretchen Whitmer runs on that, she wins. In Kansas, it was the fact that they had so defunded schools through their trickle-down model that in some parts of Kansas, like other states, they're down to 4 days of school a week. Wow. And if you're a parent of young kids like I am, you understand that's not a partisan problem. That's a problem.
No question.
That's a problem around your not only your kids' education, but what do we do on Fridays, honey? We got to figure out what to do with our kids.
Well, David, help me, because I think you wrote this. Did you say that it got so bad that they had to stop school? They ended school early.
Yeah, they would literally have fewer days of school a week. So defund. So what did Laura Kelly focus on? Almost nothing I've talked about, which is, I'm not saying run a 30-second ad on this conversation. Sure. She said, I grew up in Kansas. And when I grew up, Kansas schools were a heart of our communities. That was Kansas values. They're destroying our schools. Let's get rid of them. She made it about something that everyone agreed on and that people were feeling in their community in both urban and rural Kansas. So she connected what clearly is a corruption and this broken model to results that people feel every day. And what I would guarantee you, in any state where we see these hijacked state houses, there will be similar issues and impacts on everyday people because of the corruption. And the best politics right now is, when you say corruption right now in politics, people think everyone's corrupt. And so they don't really respond. But if you say, are you concerned that you now don't have school on Fridays for your kids? Are you concerned that an energy grid in Texas shut down so people froze to death? Are you concerned that small towns are dying with lack of infrastructure? All of a sudden, you're getting to issues that people care about who aren't even paying attention. And I think, and that's why you have a Democratic governor in Kansas. She smartly talked about issues that were impacted by these corrupt systems. And that's what I think people all around the country have to do, especially in states that are harder to win. Absolutely. Focus on the corruption and the impact of that corruption on everyday people. And all of a sudden, you've got a campaign you can run.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And this is very powerful. In fact, what we'll do now is pause, and when we come back, we're going to spend our last block with you leading us through some of the solutions that you walk us through. And you walk us through it at the national level, the state level, and the individual level, which is so very important. So many of our viewers look at this and say, well, what can I do? And you talk about even as we look back, as we kind of stand back from it and look over the country. We had Steve Phillips on a while back, and he talks about this new majority, and you talk about it as well. And of course, we want you to talk about some of this in your work with Stacey Abrams, your friend Stacey Abrams, and so many others, really helping to build a new way of moving in this country. So we'll be back in a moment with David Pepper, author of Laboratories of Autocracy, here at the Black Table. We'll be back in a moment.
Don't you think it's time to get wealthy? I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show on the Black Star Network focuses on the things your financial advisor or bank isn't telling you. So watch get wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the network. Join the Bring the Funk fan club. Tell your friends. Make a donation. Continue to support all the shows on the platform, and we will all benefit from that type of support and work. We're back with our guest, David Pepper, author of Laboratories of Autocracy. David, you really make a compelling case in part 3 of the book for things that we can do right now. And you give us practical examples when you talk about the fact that we must all participate, that we must, in fact, leave no place uncontested. And we shouldn't make compromises at the state level just because we want one thing in a bill. We accept the rider and then we end up getting screwed. But, you know, you begin part 3 of the book with this conversation about the guarantee clause. Now, you and I both probably had classmates, and they're probably law professors that don't spend much time. Do you mind opening up? What is the guarantee clause, and why should we be?
Yeah, this one I went a little con law at one part of the book. So the founders actually worried that state houses could be used as the vehicle to undermine America's democracy in the exact way that's happening today. They worried that state houses were easily corruptible. They worried that outside powers like the monarchy they were trying to escape from would use state houses because state houses have the powers that we described over election rules, over districts, over every issue, that they would use them as a backdoor to undermine America's democracy. I mean, James Madison wrote about that. That was a worry of his. That, as he put it, rich men would do this. He was thinking about ALEC hundreds of years before.
Wow.
And not only did they write this, but they put in, it's totally forgotten, they put in the Constitution something called the guarantee clause. It says the United States shall guarantee to every state a Republican form of government. And by that, they meant the majority will should generally drive that state government. And they said the United States shall guarantee that. And one example when this was used was after the Civil War, they would not allow Southern states back into the Union until those states showed that they had a system set up that would reflect the people of that state.
Absolutely.
And so my point here is we need to act like this clause exists now, starting with the President of the United States and every senator and every congressman. The truth is, and this is a very blunt thing to say, we have many states in this country right now that I do not believe really are Republican forms of government. They are answering to ALEC and donors, and they have nothing to do with people of their states. I don't care if it's a Republican or Democratic state. The people aren't really at the table anymore. Absolutely. These are too gerrymandered, they're too suppressed, and they're basically driven by that ALEC agenda. And I think the first people this is on the responsibility to do something about is Congress. They take an oath to the Constitution, which means they take an oath to guarantee that every state has a Republican form of government. And they need to act on that oath. And they should have acted on it last term with the Voting Rights Act and the John Lewis Act and all the things that were there. Yes. And they need to do that again the next time they have a chance. But the rest of us should also see that the heart of our democracy is the health of our state level governments. In the right hands, they can do great things. And in the wrong hands, they can suppress democracy itself, as we're seeing in Tennessee. And the reason I think that's so important is it means that democracy is sort of in the balance wherever you live in America. Not just a few swing states for a presidential year, not just Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia. Wherever you live, the front line of democracy is your state house. It's your state. They are trying to attack the engagement of voters in your community. And so my hope is that lets people see that far more than just worrying about some debate in Congress or if John Fetterman's going to win, and obviously I'm glad he won, in your community, do you have a state rep who's an extremist that hasn't been challenged in a number of terms? Are you in a community like in Ohio where the voters of our cities like Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus are being suppressed all the time? And are you fighting back for those voters? Whether or not you have a federal Senate seat that's up, you are on the front line of democracy. So That guarantee clause was the founders saying state houses are the front line. They need to be more they need to be democratic in their approach. The Congress needs to act on that. But the rest of us, rather than just waiting for Congress to figure this out, there is so much we can do to lift voters, to lift democracy. I'll just give a couple examples of this. So
if you don't mind, and
four voters in Ohio have been just devastated by the purging of voters, okay?
Yes.
Nonstop. I go through the book. It's painful how much they've destroyed the Obama coalition through purging and now of a new voter ID law. So what I would say to every mayor of a city in Cincinnati, in Ohio, and I'm saying this, hey, when someone goes to your rec center in the city of Cincinnati or your health clinic, do you ask them if they're registered? Do you register them? Do you tell them they need a voter ID to vote now under the new law? And the answer in most places will be no, we don't do that. Well, the answer is the question, well, why not? Your voters are being suppressed by the folks in Columbus because they live in the city, because of how they vote. You have every right and I'd say responsibility to lift your voters back into the democracy they're being removed from, but we just don't do it enough. Or what if every homeless shelter in Ohio should be registering every single person who walks into that shelter, every food bank, again, every health clinic? We should be putting on our shoulders the people who are the targets of the suppression for the purposes we've talked about all show, and we should be saying we're fighting for them. And right now, there's a very tough attack on democracy.
Yes.
It's part of our history. But if you look at our history, the result of the battle for democracy always comes back to who's fighting harder. And if the side who cares about democracy fights hard, it actually wins. Yes. And right now, I worry that we're not fighting hard enough or smart enough. We're waiting for Congress, but every single day we could be lifting voters wherever we live. We could be challenging every extremist in every state house district wherever we live, and we too often aren't doing that. And I wrote the book, and I'm writing another book because I think, again, the deciding factor in the battle for democracy is the strength of the fight of those who care about democracy. Right now, I worry we take it for granted too much. We are getting fatalistic that we just can't win, when every single day there are voters being suppressed, walking through doors of facilities that we could be registering them in, and we're not even talking to them. Absolutely. So that's a couple examples, but the way I challenge every listener to think about this is, whether you're a mayor, you run a business, or you run a nonprofit, or you teach, whatever, you have a footprint of influence in this world. How much of that footprint right now are you using to lift democracy?
Absolutely.
And my worry is, while some of your listeners are using a whole lot of their footprint, many others just don't think they should or don't think they can. And I would say you can do a lot more, I think. Again, do you know the board member of that homeless shelter? Do you know the mayor of a city? Have you asked her or him, hey, are you registering people? Knowing the mayor, that's a big part of your footprint. Let's put it to work. Do you know a restaurant who serves customers who we know are being purged? We asked people in Columbus to do this, and they did it. Does that restaurant take the time to say, hey, are you registered? They could.
Oh, no question.
There's so many things we could all be doing. And the reason it's so important, the scale of the attack on democracy is here. It's full time. It's the Koch brothers. It's taxpayer money. The scale of the side fighting for democracy, it's here. It's split the pots. It's volunteering. We need to scale it up. The only way we'll scale up is if we all figure out in our own footprint, our own sphere of influence, there's far more we can do to fight for democracy than we typically do. And it may mean we're going to a little bit of uncomfortable places. But folks, if we're not willing to get uncomfortable right now fighting for democracy, the other side's going to win.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. In the couple of minutes we have left, we know your new book is here, which expands on part 3 of Laboratories of Autocracy. And whereas in part 3 of Laboratories of Autocracy, you talk about everything at the national level, from finally blowing up the filibuster to grappling with this question. I love how you narrate this as fierce and unconventional resistance. Of course, raising the Stacey Abrams the issue, and also in Ohio there, what was it? Ms. Freshour, I think, ran against Jim Jordan, and while she lost, you redefined victory to say no, but you drug along, you became almost the captain. What is it, of those 14 counties? I mean, you brought them together and helped elevate profile. Do you mind spending these last couple of minutes talking a little bit about how you expand out in your new book, part 3 of Laboratories of Autocracy, and how we should be?
Yeah, I talked about it here with the engagement, but in a time where democracy is under attack by lack of accountability, by rigging districts so that they hope no one runs, one thing we have to do is redefine what running for office is. Running for office itself is a massive act of public service at a time where democracy is under attack. And if all we do, as we've done in the past, is think, well, the run was only valuable if you won. And if you didn't win, we're going to kind of ignore that you even ran, and we're not going to thank you. We're not going to even support you. Then we will have what we have now, which is more than 50% of the Republican legislature Tennessee without a Democrat even running against them. And the lack of any opposition is crushing politics. No wonder they feel unaccountable. They can act like crazy people and still get reelected. They don't even have an opposition. We have to treat people running everywhere. We have to value it. We have to thank people for it. We have to treat it as public service itself, even if they don't win. And I go through that in the book, and I go through examples of people who were great champions of democracy, patriots. They didn't win, but their run mattered. Because the truth is, we have to run for every office in this country. Win or lose, by running, you're shining a light on statehouses most people don't watch. You're bringing some accountability most people don't feel. The run itself is a critical part. So in the new book, I go through a lot of different things, but one chapter is all about how we create an infrastructure that we don't have today that values running everywhere. And the difference of an infrastructure that values running everywhere and one that only runs for a few seats is enormous when it comes to trying to win this battle for democracy.
Absolutely. And we're right up against the clock, but I would be remiss, man, if I didn't ask you about Moore versus Harper. I mean, what do you think what do you think the court's going to do with this independent state legislation? We've devoted a couple of shows to it, but I don't know. I'm just picking. What do you think?
I mean, my hope is they're worried that Democrats have now won a couple more legislatures, like Michigan and Pennsylvania. So they're like, well, wait a second. We don't want to give them as much power as we did before Democrats won these state houses. So I hope they kick it because they say it's no longer relevant because the North Carolina court changed. But Moore v. Harper is sort of, if you believe my Laboratories of Autocracy theory, which is the heart of the attack on democracy is state houses.
Yes.
Moore v. Harper is the kicker. It's saying, great, not only are these state houses no longer accountable because they're gerrymandered, they're no longer even accountable to their own courts. And by the way, we've lived the Moore v. Harper nightmare in Ohio for the last year and a half. They simply didn't follow court orders. That would happen around the country. So it would be a nightmare. It would be completely inconsistent with our Constitution and the history of our country. And I hope, though, that they get worried enough about what it means in democratically run states that they get cold feet. And I think that may be more likely than people think, that they think, well, geez, that means that new Michigan legislature can do whatever it wants.
Yes.
And the New York one could draw maps that a court in the future couldn't strike down. They're only a majority in Congress because they won a bunch of New York congressional seats.
That's true.
Well, if Moore v. Harper goes the way that the North Carolina Republicans want, that New York legislature would say, okay, we're going to do whatever we want. We get, 90% of the congressional seats. So maybe there's enough fear about what this means to the Republican cause that they hold back. But as a matter of the case and the law itself, it puts on steroids all the problems I already walked through that are already a nightmare in Laboratories of Autocracy. And it says they're not even any more accountable to the law itself or the people of their state through constitutional amendments, which be one other sort of a nail in the coffin to any sense that these states are functioning rule of law democracies.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to have you back to discuss the new book because we didn't get a chance to get into independent journalism. Although we will mention at this time that on the platform that's under siege, but still useful, Twitter, we can follow you at David Pepper and also visit your website, of course, laboratories of autocracy.com. We want to thank you, man, for spending this hour with us and for helping us continue to try to work through these very real challenges of living together in a society where it isn't weighted for the advantage of the ultra rich and those who don't have our common humanity in their minds as our best interest. So thank you, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a great conversation. I appreciate the invitation.
Agree, man. We'll see you again soon, man. We'll see you again soon. We'll be back here at the Black Table. I'll clear the table and we'll prepare for next week. Back in a moment.
hatred on the streets. A horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds.
As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol, we've seen
We're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance. We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
Here's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. We've spent a very productive and enlightening hour with David Pepper, author of Laboratories of Autocracy, a wake-up call from behind the lines. I hope everyone paid very specific attention, especially to what each of us can do. One of the things that David writes about in the book is the comparison between where we are today in the first fifth of the 21st century and where this country, the United States of America, was in the last quarter of the 19th century, the period after the Civil War. If you remember, or if you didn't see it, go back and look at the conversation we had with Professor Kermit Roosevelt and his book, The Nation That Never Was, where he talks about the Reconstruction Constitution and how that differs in some ways from the Founders' Constitution. That was the Constitution that included, theoretically, all of us, the Civil War amendments. And you heard David talk about the power of the federal government to ensure that the states provide a Republican form of government. Well, they exercised that power after the Civil War. And David also writes about what happened after that, the long retreat. We had our conversations with Richard Kreitner, for example, among others, in his book, Break It Up, where we see what happens when the federal government retreats. Ralph Bunche. We talked about Ralph Bunche in a previous episode. Ralph Bunche once said that the Negro in this country is a special ward of the Supreme Court. And certainly what we saw with the retreat of the Supreme Court in the 1880s and 90s, probably hitting a watershed moment in Plessy versus Ferguson, was that those states in the South in particular went rogue and started depriving people of their voting rights, particularly people of African descent, men of African descent. So what do we face today? We face an opportunity, a heroic age, to have a new heroic age in this country. James Madison didn't intend for me to vote. He intended me to keep Montpelier running, his plantation. However, the framework that he participated in is not stuck in the 18th century. It is now the 21st century. And David Pepper is reminding us that we can live in the type of society we all want, but only if we all participate. So we'll see you next week here at the Black Table. Remember to support the Black Star Network and join us.